Few things in life are more disappointing than looking forward to a game only to realize it's a massive letdown. Some open world titles set high expectations but end up plagued by bland gameplay, technical issues, and a lot of missed potential. Today we're looking at 10 open world games that failed to live up to the hype. Some of these games improved post-launch, but some of them missed the mark completely. So let's get into it. The 2022 reboot of Saints Row set out to recapture the series' open world roots, stripping away a lot of the over-the-top absurdity in favor of a more grounded approach. However, instead of just dialing back the absurdity, the game seemingly dialed back a lot of the fun as well. And this philosophy exposed the game's outdated mechanics, repetitive mission design, and technical shortcomings. While there was still some enjoyment in the chaotic shootouts, car chases, and collectibles scattered across the city, the gameplay loop just quickly became stale. Combat was uninspired, and the driving mechanics, despite incorporating some Burnout-style takedowns, just wasn't really that great. Character customization is where I actually had the most fun, making a goofy character with a dumb voice and just hearing him say stupid things.
It's not my first time shooting up a place with a minigun, ma'am. Just the first time people are happy I did it.
And the game did have some decent customization options. That was a bright spot, but it still couldn't compensate for the game's lack of overall innovation. Beyond the gameplay, Saints Row struggled with its new identity. It moved away from the edgy humor and fun that really pushed the envelope, instead introducing a set of characters that would be better fitted for a BuzzFeed video. While the game does have some funny moments, Saints Row just doesn't feel like the same franchise anymore. Furthermore, it had a shallow open world, underwhelming mission structure, and while Santo Ileso did have some nice landmarks and occasional flair, it lacked real meaningful interactivity within the world. To make matters worse, the game was riddled with bugs, from broken mission objectives to bizarre AI behavior, making an already frustrating experience just even more aggravating. Despite its high production cost of over $100 million, Saints Row ultimately failed to even justify its existence. It lacked the charm of the older games and the polish expected of a modern title, making it a huge disappointment. Ubisoft's Skull and Bones was in development for over 10 years. The initial idea was an expansion for Assassin's Creed Black Flag before morphing into an MMO and then finally a multiplayer action game. Despite its long development cycle and Ubisoft branding it as the first quadruple A title,
Serious?
the final game fell well short of expectations, feeling more like a hollow live service game than a real pirate adventure. Many had hoped for an immersive open world experience where you could engage in pirate politics, recruit cool crewmates, and carve out your own legacy. Instead, Skull and Bones delivers a repetitive and boring gameplay experience. While the ship combat does have some pretty cool and fun aspects to it, it's just not enough to make the game an engaging experience. Worse still, the game reportedly cost Ubisoft over $200 million to develop, potentially even more, making it a really expensive flop. Ubisoft had a golden opportunity to build on Black Flag's beloved mechanics, but instead Skull and Bones removes most of what would make a pirate game actually fun. Being able to board ships, fight hand to hand, and get scurvy. Well, maybe not that last part. The end result is a hollow experience that fails to justify the massive budget. Reports even suggest that Skull and Bones was such a failure that it directly contributed to Ubisoft's financial decline. It truly is a disappointment on all fronts. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League had all the potential to be a worthy successor to Rocksteady's Arkham series, but instead it became one of the biggest AAA disappointments in recent memory. Despite some strong character writing and some entertaining banter, the gameplay was another repetitive loop of uninspired gunplay, forgettable missions, and a lackluster story. The game offered a short campaign that ran out of ideas quickly. Boss fights did offer some variety, with Green Lantern's battle standing out, but even these moments are undercut by poor pacing and an overall lack of just narrative cohesion. It's evident that Suicide Squad struggled to define what it really wanted to be, seemingly caught between a traditional single-player experience and a live service shooter, with neither one of those fully realized to make a really complete game. From a financial standpoint, Suicide Squad was a colossal failure, contributing to a staggering 41% decline in video game revenue for Warner Bros. Discovery. The game was built with an enormous budget and almost a decade of development, only to debut to rapidly dwindling player numbers. It's the kind of game that's meant to be played indefinitely, yet it struggled to keep people engaged for even a few hours. Though it managed to avoid being completely soulless thanks to some well-written characters, the game ultimately became a cautionary tale of wasted potential. Oh boy, let's discuss Redfall.
Moving like Dracula, we get it back in blood.
Redfall was supposed to be Arcane's ambitious take on an open-world co-op vampire shooter, but it ultimately became one of the biggest disappointments in recent gaming history. And this is coming from a studio that has some fantastic games in the past. From the onset, Redfall struggled with uninspired mission design, frustrating busy work, and technical problems that made it feel unfinished. Despite some traces of Arkane's signature style seen in the protagonist's special abilities, Redfall lacked the depth and polish of a Dishonored or Deathloop, offering instead a dull and empty world.
50,000 people used to live here. Now it's a ghost town.
Missions were repetitive, forcing players into mundane scavenger hunts or identical fights against brain-dead AI. And while the story, mostly delivered through static images, was also very forgettable. Even the supernatural vampire nests meant to be these unique challenges quickly became repetitive due to recycled level design. And the final boss fight basically boiled down to going around and pressing the same button 3 times, encapsulating the game's lack of imagination. While the game did have some decent movement and gameplay mechanics, it just simply couldn't make up for all of the problems. Redfall was plagued with performance issues, including broken animations and persistent bugs, some of which that rendered enemies unkillable or turned teammates into floating guns. Ultimately, Redfall was a disaster, leading to Microsoft shutting down Arcane Austin, canceling planned DLC, and even issuing refunds. It's a cautionary tale of a game that failed at every level: design, execution, and post-launch support, cementing its place as one of the most notorious gaming failures in recent memory. Fallout 76 was a massive departure from previous Fallout games, aiming to create a persistent multiplayer world set in the post-apocalyptic landscape of Appalachia. However, its launch in 2018 was marred by a lack of focus, technical issues, and a world devoid of the series' signature NPC-driven storytelling. With no human characters to interact with, players were left to explore an empty wasteland, where quests were delivered through holotapes and terminal entries rather than actual engaging conversations. While the environmental storytelling and exploration did have some enjoyable aspects, the absence of meaningful interactions and the inability to just influence the world around you made the game feel lifeless. And multiplayer, which was meant to be a key selling point, often felt cumbersome rather than engaging. And combat also suffered as the new VAT system turned into an uninspired auto-aim mechanic. Combined with numerous bugs, performance issues, and lackluster quest design, Fallout 76 struggled, ultimately feeling like a stale iteration of a beloved franchise. Despite the disastrous launch, Bethesda has worked to turn Fallout 76 into a better experience overall. The 2020 Wastelanders update was a significant turning point in the game, reintroducing human NPCs, factions, and traditional quest lines, which revitalized the game's storytelling and made Appalachia feel more alive. And subsequent updates continue to refine the game. While the game still carries some of its original flaws, it has evolved into a more engaging experience. Much like No Man's Sky, Fallout 76 has undergone a redemption arc, proving that ongoing support and player feedback can transform a game once considered a failure into something worthwhile. But it also serves as a reminder to developers to just get it right the first time. Forspoken promised an exciting blend of magical parkour, flashy combat, and a rich open world, but it ultimately fell short of expectations due to a lackluster story and uninspired world design. The game followed Frey Holland, an orphan from New York who gets transported to the mythical land of Athia, where she takes on the role of a hero against the corrupted rulers known as the Tantas. While the core combat and movement systems in Forspoken were actually pretty interesting, allowing Frey to swap between elemental attacks as well as traverse the landscape with these stylish, fluid parkour movements, these mechanics never really evolved into something truly deep or challenging. The open world design, meanwhile, was sprawling yet empty, offering repetitive side quests and little incentive to explore beyond a checklist of these uninspired objectives. One of the biggest disappointments is how Forspoken failed to really establish meaningful character dynamics, particularly between the two main characters, Frey and her talking armband companion named Cuff, making it hard to really invest in their journey. And to make matters worse, the campaign's 15-hour runtime really rushed through a lot of key points. While combat does become more enjoyable as Frey unlocks additional abilities, enemy variety remained underwhelming, and the world of Athia lacks compelling landmarks or secrets to really discover. Even the RPG elements such as equipment and upgrades felt uninspired, offering mostly numerical boosts rather than anything that meaningfully affected gameplay. Forspoken ultimately struggled to justify its vast world and ambitious mechanics, resulting in an experience that, while occasionally fun, was largely forgettable. Anthem was a game that promised an exciting blend of co-op multiplayer action, deep RPG mechanics, and an engaging sci-fi story. It looked like such an interesting concept, but ultimately failed to deliver a cohesive and satisfying gameplay experience. While the game's combat is initially strong with responsive fight mechanics and punchy third-person shooting, its repetitive and uninspired mission structure quickly drains the excitement. The campaign forced players through tedious fetch quests and capture points while really failing to take advantage of more engaging mechanics like strongholds or powerful loot until the very end game. Even the story, which had moments of strong character work, work was bogged down by inconsistent interactions, lack of meaningful choices, and a disconnect between the single-player story and the always online multiplayer world. The result is a campaign that felt like a slog, offering little incentive to engage with its world until reaching the level cap, where gameplay finally became fun. Even in the endgame, where Anthem showed flashes of potential, a host of technical and design flaws really held it back. Bugs, crashes, and frustrating mechanics made experimentation and progression more tedious than rewarding. Weapon and ability balancing was wildly inconsistent, and the most interesting gear was locked behind this lengthy grind. Despite its solid foundation of movement and combat, Anthem's lack of meaningful content, unpolished systems, and progression roadblocks left it feeling like a missed opportunity rather than the groundbreaking new entry that it should have been, making it another game with massive expectations and a disappointing reality. After years of delays, Crackdown 3 arrived with the promise of delivering the same high-octane chaos that defined its previous games. Players take on the role of an agent tasked with dismantling a sinister corporation by methodically eliminating its various factions, all while growing stronger through the signature orb collecting mechanic. While the core gameplay of leaping between rooftops, causing destruction, and mowing down waves of enemies remained intact, the overall experience felt dated, repetitive, and uninspired. The open world structure quickly devolved into a series of rinse and repeat objectives with little variation, making combat feel like a monotonous chore rather than an engaging challenge. And despite much of the touted cloud-powered destruction, Crackdown 3 failed to integrate this technology into the core campaign, relegating the large-scale destruction advertised to the underwhelming Wrecking Zone multiplayer mode. And looking back now, the destruction didn't really look that good anyway. While the sight of crumbling Lego blocks is momentarily impressive, the lock-on aiming system and lack of strategic gameplay elements made competitive matches feel shallow and unfulfilling. The single-player campaign, meanwhile, suffered from a lack of meaningful enemy variety and mission design that offered little incentive beyond just checking off the objectives. While there were some fleeting moments of fun, such as rooftop races and the thrill of unlocking the higher level abilities, the game never really evolved beyond its initial premise, making it a disappointing and outdated experience that failed to deliver. Biomutant was an ambitious single-player action RPG that offered a unique take on the post-apocalypse, replacing human survivors with mutant animals who have mastered martial arts. With clear influences from games like Horizon Zero Dawn, Breath of the Wild, and even Kung Fu Panda, Biomutant presented a vibrant open world filled with customizable weapons, a deep combat system, and imaginative enemy designs. Players could create their own warrior and shape their journey by aligning with tribes and deciding the fate of the Tree of Life. However, while its setting and visual creativity really stood out, the gameplay structure quickly became repetitive. The game is initially exciting with its character creation and world building, but quickly falls into a pattern of predictable encounters and fetch quests, making the overall experience feel a lot less dynamic than the premise suggests. Unfortunately, Biomutant's shortcomings extend beyond mission design. The boss fights lacked meaningful variation, and the narrative missed its intended depth. Combat offered an impressive array of options, but enemy AI often struggled with environmental obstacles, leading to frustrating encounters. Despite the world's striking landscapes, and I will say they are beautiful, and the sheer number of enemy designs, the gameplay loop revolved too much around collecting and grinding. Ultimately, while Biomutant succeeds in crafting a visually rich and original world, its repetitive objectives, shallow storytelling, and uneven mechanics prevent it from really living up to its ambitious potential. And then there was Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk 2077 was one of the most highly anticipated games of all time, promising an expansive, immersive RPG experience set in a dystopian future. And the reason that this game is on the list is much different than the others. The game boasted deep character customization, meaningful choices, and a vibrant open world filled with quests, intrigue, and cybernetic enhancements. Players expected a revolutionary experience where they could shape their own path in Night City. And while the game did deliver on some of these fronts, offering standout side quests, an intriguing hacking system, and really memorable characters, it quickly became clear that Cyberpunk 2077 had a lot of issues. The game is incredible in a lot of ways, but it did fail to live up to the grand vision that had been sold, especially at launch. The game's shortcomings were particularly evident in its disjointed narrative structure and the disconnect between the main story and side content. Players often felt like they were role-playing two separate versions of V, one in the main story where urgency was paramount and another in side quests, where they had the freedom to explore and shape their character. The most infamous aspect of Cyberpunk 2077's launch was its technical failures.
Can't deny it, it's all true. But everybody still wants to live here. This city's always got a promise for you. Might be a lie, an illusion. but it's there.
The game was a disaster with game-breaking bugs, AI issues, and visual glitches galore. On the base PS4 and Xbox One, the game was basically unplayable, leading to Sony temporarily pulling it from the PlayStation Store. What was meant to be a groundbreaking RPG turned into one of gaming's biggest cautionary tales, over-promising and under-delivering a game with massive hype. Thankfully, Cyberpunk is now in a much better place and has a lot of great elements about it. The game excels at immersing you into its world with some incredible characters and factions, great storytelling, and unique gameplay mechanics. While Cyberpunk's initial launch was definitely disappointing, it's now a much better experience and definitely a game I feel is worth playing. But be sure and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And there you have it, 10 open world games that were huge disappointments. While those games may have been disappointing, there's still plenty of great games. Check out the video on your screen where I discuss nearly 19 perfect games you need to play. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more gaming content. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.